Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely wild. Wittgenstein, language, meaning, and the limits of thought. We're going to trace the profound evolution of Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is a thinker who literally revolutionized the philosophy of language single-handedly. And he didn't just do it once, he did it twice. But here's the crazy part, the real plot twist. His second revolution, it completely dismantled his first one. So we're going to explore how language actually shapes our reality, how meaning is generated, and maybe most importantly, where the absolute limits of human thought truly lie. Let's get into it.
All right, so we'll start with his most famous and honestly most staggering claim. In his early masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published back in the 1920s, he argued something massive. He said that our understanding of the world is entirely shaped, totally bounded by the language we use. Essentially, if a concept can't be conveyed by our linguistic structures, well, it completely falls outside of our reality as we experience it.
So that brings up a pretty fascinating question for all of us, right? Think about it for a second. Is our everyday reality bounded entirely by the vocabulary we just so happen to possess? According to the early Wittgenstein, if something is unsayable, it's actually fundamentally unthinkable. Our language isn't just some handy tool we use to describe a world that's already there. No, the very structures and rules of our language literally construct the boundaries of our known universe. It's a huge idea. But to really understand these limits, we've got to briefly look at the man himself. Wittgenstein was, well, he was a genius who lived a life of intense extremes. He was born into one of the wealthiest industrialist families in Vienna. We're talking Brahms and Klimt as regular house guests kind of wealthy. But he ultimately gave away his entire fortune. He went from high society to teaching in rural Austrian schools, worked as a hospital porter, and even designed this meticulously rigid modernist house for his sister, who, by the way, probably just wanted a normal, cozy home. He was a man deeply suspicious of philosophical abstraction, always chasing absolute clarity, yet his life and work revealed these incredible, almost mystical depths.
Okay, Act 1, the picture. Let's dive into early Wittgenstein and the Tractatus.
So, in this early work, he set out with a wildly ambitious goal. He literally wanted to definitively solve all of philosophy. No big deal, right? Wittgenstein proposed what's known as the picture theory of language. He argued that the world isn't just a random pile of objects, it's made up of facts or states of affairs. And language, it works by literally picturing these logical states. A sentence is only meaningful if its elements perfectly mirror the relationships between objects in the real world. Basically, a proposition is a logical photograph of a fact. To explain this, he used this wonderful analogy of a traffic court in Paris. So just as they used little model cars on a table to represent an actual car crash on the street, the grammatical arrangement of words in a sentence represents how objects combine in reality. The structure of the picture shares a direct, logical form with the structure of the fact it represents.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Wittgenstein's strict language boundaries actually mirror a much older philosophical idea by Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that we can only ever really know phenomena, things as they appear to us. Meanwhile, the true essence of things, the noumena, is forever fenced off from human cognition. Similarly, Wittgenstein argued we can only ever speak of logical facts. Anything else, ethics, aesthetics, the meaning of life, God, that all belongs to the mystical realm. It is firmly, permanently beyond the boundary of logical language.
Which brings us to our next section, the unsayable and silence, facing the mystical.
But, as you might guess, this rigid logical framework creates a massive problem for humanity. If language is strictly limited to empirical facts, what happens to morality? What about art or the soul? Well, this leads us to the closing statement of the Tractatus, which is honestly one of the most famous conclusions in all of philosophy. Wittgenstein famously drew a hard, absolute boundary around what our words can achieve, declaring, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. Basically, if a topic falls outside the realm of logical facts, attempting to speak about it logically just results in pure nonsense.
But hold on, because recent scholarship reveals a pretty disquieting, active edge to this famous quote. The original German verb schweigen doesn't quite translate to just being silent in a passive way. It's actually much more active. Rather than just passively ignoring the mystical or the ethical, Wittgenstein is suggesting that we are bound to actively enact silence when confronting these profound truths. Silence itself becomes a powerful activity. It's a way of acknowledging the ineffable things that simply cannot be put into words.
And this brings us to the famous Tractatus paradox. See, throughout the entire book, Wittgenstein used logical language to explain the limits of logical language. He used words to point to the mystical things he literally just claimed words couldn't touch. Acknowledging this, he states that his own propositions are, ultimately, nonsense. They were just a ladder. Once you climb up and understand his point, you have to throw the ladder away. He wanted to therapeutically cure us of the urge to philosophize about the unsayable.
Now, here is the greatest twist in modern thought. Decades later, after returning to philosophy, Wittgenstein realized his first monumental masterpiece was fundamentally wrong. Yeah, the picture theory was just too rigid, so he pivoted entirely. He moved away from the idea of language as a static mirror of reality to a radically pragmatic view, a view where language is actually a flexible toolkit.
So let's get into Act 2, the game, meaning as use. In his posthumous masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations, he completely abandons the mirror analogy and introduces the language game. He argued that words, they don't have inherent static essences. They don't have fixed logical structures. Instead, the meaning of a word is entirely dependent on how it's used within the specific rule-governed social game being played. Meaning isn't a picture. Meaning is an activity.
To get this, imagine a primitive language used by a builder and an assistant. When the builder shouts slab, he's not statically describing a piece of rock, and he isn't logically picturing a state of affairs. No, slab is a dynamic action. It's a command to bring the rock. The meaning of the word is simply its function in the activity of building. That's the game.
Language is deeply woven into what he called our forms of life. Take a single word like water. Depending entirely on the social scenario, that one single word can dramatically shift its purpose. It could be a desperate request from a thirsty person, an order to a waiter, an exclamation of joy finding a spring, or a frantic warning that the water is poisoned. The context, the specific game we are playing in that moment, dictates the meaning.
This leads us to the private language argument. Can you have a secret language?
Consider his famous beetle-in-the-box thought experiment. It's brilliant. Imagine everyone has a small box, and inside is something we all call a beetle. But here's the catch. No one can ever look inside anyone else's box. Everyone only knows what a beetle is by looking at their own. Wittgenstein points out that whatever is actually inside the box becomes completely irrelevant to the public meaning of the word beetle. The box could even be empty. The actual private object drops out of the language game entirely.
So you might be wondering, could you invent a language that only you understand to describe your private sensations? Well, Wittgenstein argues no. Why? Because language fundamentally requires rules, and rules require a public, shared community to verify them. If you try to invent a word for a private sensation that only you feel, you literally have no external standard of correctness to ensure you're using the word right the next time you feel it. Without public criteria, meaning just collapses. Therefore, a purely private language is literally impossible.
So how do we talk about our feelings then? Even our most intimate sensations are bound by public language. Wittgenstein explains that when a child hurts himself and cries, adults step in and teach him exclamation words, and later full sentences. Saying I am in pain is not some private label slapped onto a secret inner feeling. It's a learned social behavior that replaces the primitive natural cry. The sensation itself is totally real, but the language we use for it is inherently public and social.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a pretty provocative thought. From his early, rigid picture theory to his later, flexible language games, Wittgenstein forced us to see that we are fundamentally bound by the words we use, which really leaves us to wonder, how many unseen boundaries do we hit every single day, simply because we haven't yet learned the rules of a new game? What profound truths are you actively passing over in silence right now, just waiting for the right words to bring them into your world? Think about that for a bit, and keep expanding your toolkit.